Good. Thank you all for making it back to your seats so quickly. For those of you who weren't here this morning, I'm Rufus York, President of the National Foreign Trade Council, and we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event along with a number of others. And I just want to say to Ken and the team what a great event it's been so far, and how important WIDA's role is in putting on these kinds of great events. I'm also, of course, personally very honored to join you today to introduce former World Bank President and former USTR, Bob Zoellick, and to moderate a discussion with him after the remarks. I have to compliment Ken and his team for landing Bob for this event, because I don't think we could have found anybody who can combine his experience on the top rung of international policy making with his own sort of high-octane brand of strategic thinking. He's not afraid to be controversial and to raise important issues. I don't know how many of you saw his Wall Street Journal piece the other day, but it's a good example of the kind of things that only someone like Bob is capable. Well, of course, I don't really need to give his resume because an audience like this, knows it well. But in addition to being World Bank President and USTR, he had a heck of a lot of other important jobs in the government, like Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Undersecretary of State, and counselor to Jim Baker when he was the Treasury Secretary, which is where I first met Bob when we were doing the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement implementation in the Congress, and I was up on Ways and Means. And of course, since then, I watched him through the Uruguay round and NAFTA and a number of other things. I got to see really firsthand the big influence he had on the trade policies of at least 3 American presidents and a lot of other governments around the world. Of course, he had a slew of jobs in the private sector. I won't even outline them all, but you can find them in his bio. He is currently senior counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical and senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School. But obviously, we're not just here to hear about his resume. I mean, as I said, he's worth listening to because he really has gained a well-deserved reputation as somebody who thinks very long-term and strategically about geopolitics and global economics, and I'm pretty sure he won't disappoint us in that because he's been giving a lot of thought lately to these trade issues and the challenges, tensions, and predicaments that we face. So our format today will be to first hear your thoughts, Bob, and then I'll follow with a few questions before hopefully turning it over to you in the audience for some participation. So on behalf of WIDA, let me thank you for being here, and let me all ask you to welcome Bob Zoellick to the stage. Thanks, Rufus.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be back here with the stalwarts of the trade community with WIDA, and I see many, many friends in the audience. But I especially am pleased to have an opportunity to be here with my friend and former colleague, Rufus York. This really dates us because Rufus, of course, was on the Democratic staff of the Ways and Means Committee, but we worked on all these trade issues. And I was delighted when he had a chance to work with the WTO and every other position that I could try to support him in, I would, because he really represented the best of the United States trade community when it comes together and works effectively. I know you also, I think this morning, acknowledged the passing of Mike Moore. I have to at least sort of take an occasion to recognize an individual who really devoted his life to these issues. I first met Mike Moore when he was the Prime Minister of New Zealand. This was under the Bush 41 administration, and it was such a sort of fresh air of relief to have this guy who was standing up for free trade. He was from the Labour Party in New Zealand, or the Centre-Left Party, whatever the name. It was Labour Party, and he was sort of pulling it to the open side. And then we worked together at the WTO. Then he served in Washington. And again, I think one of the extraordinary qualities about Mike was that not only was he committed, but he could do all this with a good sense of humor and spirit. He was a wonderful person, so we will miss him. I also want to compliment Ken and the organizers. You really have an excellent program. I saw that Chad Bone was here right before I was, and I'm glad that you were able to invite him, and because Chad is the example of the future here in terms of the type of work he does. I hope all of you are on his distribution list, but I serve on the board of the Peterson Institute. I'm very fortunate to sort of get a lot of the background and ideas from Chad. So there's a good community here, and I thought what I might usefully try to do is to supplement some of the discussions you've had today by stepping back just a little bit to offer some quick observations on 4 topics. Changing outlook for global trade, the essentials of Trump's trade policy, at least as I see it, my quick take on the U.S.-China deal, and some suggestions on how business executives might navigate the swirling currents, since I know a number of you advise them. So first, what's happening on the trade landscape? What I think is very interesting is from 1990 to 2007, trade grew 2 times faster than GDP growth. Over the past year, since 2007, it's slipped below, and the IMF forecast is that it will remain below. Now, this is in part protectionism, but it's also a sign that there are other things going on. And while trade in goods is down, trade in services is up considerably. It's grown about 60% faster than goods since 2007. And while by the formal accounting, services are only about 20% of the total, if you include intangibles and digital with affiliates, at least according to the McKinsey Global Institute, it comes to about half a trade. So this is going to be an area of the future, and it is already today. Also, within those big macro numbers, it's important to distinguish regional variations in growth. You're starting to see different patterns in the regional trade process, including some concentration, especially in the areas of autos, computers, electronics. Not surprisingly, the biggest area of trade growth has been patterns within Asia. And the patterns are changing than from they were even 5 or 10 years ago. And the heart of this, obviously, is the changes with China. So China is developing its own supply chains. It's got greater consumption. It's moving up the value chain. And this will have implications for commodities and logistics chains. The coronavirus, which I think, at least according to today's news, is starting to get more attention, I think is actually going to be even bigger than markets first recognized. You just anecdotally, you run into more and more people that they're not doing the traveling, the shutting down businesses all throughout China. So after complaining about the rising power of China, we're now going to see a little bit what it's like when China sort of stumbles, and I don't think it's going to be so good for everybody in the process. Another big change is in the nature of the supply chains. They are increasingly no longer reliant primarily on labor costs. It's more knowledge intensive. And so within those supply chains, there's a focus on higher skilled labor. Another key factor to watch is the technology shifts. And let me just highlight 2 of these. One that Chad and others have focused on is the area of 3D printing. Now, people at first thought, look, 3D printing is going to have a shift because the old supply chains were described by large batches, specialized components, and assembly over various markets. And 3D starts to move you to small batches, customized, and on-site. And so people thought, well, maybe this will reduce the process of trade. One of the first studies on this looked at the area of hearing aids, which was an early 3D sort of development process. And somewhat contrary to people's expectations, it boosted trade, so it didn't concentrate it in the areas of producers near the consumer sites, because it had lower costs and higher quality. And the countries that were the leading producers before 3D, Switzerland, Denmark, Singapore, continued to lead. Now, maybe this will be different with the heavier product process, but it's an example of how technology is also shifting the trade area. And a second observation of that type is you can see that the value chains are closely linked to cross-border data flows. So the digital platforms will be fundamental for the future process of trade. One more big picture item, which I gather you discussed this morning, I think the governance process is falling far behind. The WTO and the rules-based systems are not only stressed with the current sort of economic agenda, But an area that I've been particularly worried about is neither they nor key countries like the United States are developing rules and standards for the newer topics. So there's a big opportunity cost. Second topic. So how might one characterize the essentials of Trump's trade policy? Well, in his inaugural, President Trump announced that he was a protectionist. I thought this was kind of a leading indicator, but many people said, oh, well, you know, he's just a negotiator and so on and so forth. Well, you know, when he then declared himself a tariff man, that should have kind of sealed it for doubters. And the focus on bilateral trade deficits, as I'll talk about China, you can see runs throughout his policy. You have to expect unpredictability and uncertainty. That's the nature of how he conducts policies. His focus is on deals, not systems. It's managed trade versus rules. And the effects of all this is it does have a dampening effect on investment. And this ripples through what will be long-term growth issues, including for things like productivity. The part that I think is perhaps the most important, and I gather you had a presentation earlier today on some of the swing voters, I think my comments are in line with this, is that trade represents a core connection to Trump's political base. And therefore, you have to see it in just not in sort of traditional political economy, political terms. This is a man who ran as an outsider and a disruptor. In some ways, the issue is like the wall in immigration. So for those of people who traditionally would see policy in Washington, when the appropriators decided not to fund the wall, most people thought, well, that's the end of it. Not if you're Trump, because he can never step back on the wall on the immigration issue. It'd be seen as conceding to this political base. So instead, he takes money out of the Defense Department. Trade is a similar issue. He'll never be able to solve the trade topic. He needs to sort of keep it boiling. A third one in this category is, frankly, ending foreign wars. He wants to pull back from these things. It created some complications for him in an issue like Iran. But these are important issues because they go to his core authenticity as a politician. And so the only real check on these issues is, frankly, the market reaction, as you saw in the process of China and sometimes in European. And what that would suggest to me is if he is reelected, you know, everybody ought to expect more of this. And the European Union is clearly in the target zone. My own belief, as I'll explain in a minute, is we're going to expect a China sequel, not necessarily this year, but to flow from it. So third, the China deal flows from these essentials that I've just mentioned. The heart of the deal is a purchase package. This matches the focus on bilateral trade deficits rather than sort of rule of law or sort of opening markets. On its face, at least to me, the deal plants a lot of seeds of future trouble. Chad has written some very good pieces on this. The starting point is that each country is free to use its own statistics. You know, for those of us who have been in negotiation, that's a rather fundamental issue. The purchases, interestingly, a lot of the reporting hasn't focused on this, fall into 4 categories, but they don't cover all of U.S. exports. So what you have to expect is China's going to do some reallocation from some of those sectors that are not included in the 4 categories because it's now in the world of managed trade, moving purchases around across countries. Of course, the irony for some of us is that managed trade relies more on state controls, not on competition. I think you're likely to see shifts of U.S. commodity exports among markets. So as we shift, perhaps some of the agricultural products will sell fewer agricultural products to others. Ours will have a slight premium, but it's not going to expand the overall trade condition. There are other provisions beyond the purchase agreement. They tend to ratify things that were already going on, that China was strengthening for its own self-interest. There has not been exchange rate manipulation for a considerable number of years. China decided to open up financial and asset management markets because, frankly, it needs a better pension and system for an aging China. You already were seeing the progress in the IPR courts, although, at least in my view, what you need there is sort of stronger penalties. And of course, the deal retains the protectionist taxes. So this is the other core aspect of my point about Trump. So U.S. tariffs remain on about 2/3 of imports from China. The average is up from about 3% pre-Trump to about 19.3% today. China's tariffs cover about 57% of U.S. exports, and the average rate is up from about 8% to 20.5%. And that 8% is now, I think, about 6.5% for other countries because China's been lowering tariffs for others. So again, as Chad has detailed, these purchase targets, frankly, looked pretty unrealistic even before you had the coronavirus. But it allows Trump to brag through the election. If he's reelected, I suspect that we're going to return to clashes and more tariffs because the logic of the negotiation, the reason if Bob Lighthizer were here is say, look, it doesn't matter about the data because we have a free ability to slap them with more tariffs. So you can see where that heads back. It's the basic idea, keep today's tariffs, use the pressure to have tariffs in the future. So in sum, I see it as the wrong objective. I don't think it'll work, but it's got political spin. And frankly, as in many of these areas now, given the changes that I mentioned in the larger environment, it misses the opportunity to deal with the real problems. Now, when I write an op-ed like the one that Rufus mentioned, I get people that say, okay, well, what would you do? I won't give you the full version. I gave a speech on this, the U.S.-China Business Council, and there's going to be an article in the National Interest in the next month where it kind of picks up on it. But let me just give you the heart of this. As a diplomatic task, it's first important to have a sense of what are you trying to address here? What are your real complaints? And I think there's been a convergence of 6 things that sort of created this brew with China. First, there's what this community would call the traditional market access issues. Not fair reciprocity in terms of tariffs and investment and IPR and forced technology transfer. A second issue is related but different, which is the fear of Chinese state capitalism and state-owned enterprises. Can you have fair competition with the state-owned system? Third is the fear that China will dominate the technologies of the future. Fourth is Belt and Road. Is it a geopolitical venture? Is it to use excess capacity? Is it development? My own view is that's some combination of all those things. A fourth is the more aggressive foreign and security policy, or fifth is more aggressive foreign and security policy. And a sixth one is the issues that cover the feeling in sort of American technical terms that a lot of the use of technology in China is creepy. So whether it's kind of the social accounting or spying on everybody. Frankly, I was just talking with a Chinese friend at another meeting this morning, and he thinks, and I think he's right, that one of the biggest ripple effects on the coronavirus is going to be on the Chinese internal political debate. Because what I was picking up for months in advance was that because Xi has sort of exerted so much authority, a lot of the officials are basically saying, we're not going to take initiative. Why should we raise our head on something? And so what you saw here is when trouble started, people were waiting for orders and directions. And I think that will lead to a debate in China where people haven't been totally excited about sort of Xi's return. He's got a lot of power in this situation. But I think this is kind of, when you have a big event like this, there's often ripple effects a little bit hard to see. But if you take my list of 6, or adjust it as you want, one of the things that's obvious is that tariffs are probably not the right wrench for trying to deal with those bolts on each one of those. A customized approach could be done for each. It would be best to do them with international partners and, frankly, with Chinese reformers, so you'll get some sympathy on a lot of these issues. And, frankly, the deal ignores this. Now, why does the deal ignore it? The reasons I said. He's focused on bilateral trade deficits, and he wants to keep sort of tariffs. So, finally, if you're talking to business executives, how would you advise that they respond to this? One, make supply chains more flexible and resilient. As I just touched on, you have to be alert to the speed of change here, not only with the geopolitics, but the regional changes, the digital changes, the different sort of technology. 2, this is an important moment to be trying to shape government policies. There's a big gap here. Because of the nature of the negotiations going on, the fights that people used to have about opening for services industries, trying to deal with standards issues, dealing with regulations for new activities, data, privacy, all these issues, those are kind of fallen to the side. And while other countries didn't necessarily welcome what the United States pressure on the system in past years, because we were a leading edge economy, it was a fit for us to always be pushing these issues, whether it was environment and labor in some of the FTAs, or whether it was some of the issues about market access, investment, services, IPR. That was kind of what the U.S. was about, and that's not what the U.S. is about today. So 3, Or an example of this was the TTIP would probably been the next generation of this, but frankly, I think that that negotiation was approached pretty half-heartedly by the Obama administration. 3, if governments falter, and I believe they will, can industry sectors start to develop their own standards? I think you're going to see more pressure to do this, but people are uncertain of how to do it. I had a conversation about a month ago with the gentleman who developed the wireless internet protocols. And he just told the story. He said, look, we came up with these standards and we didn't know whether people would adopt them. But they just kind of moved through the system. And now we all assume those things are sort of part of life. I think you're going to see more and more need by sort of business communities. And frankly, best if they can do it in a cross-border way, try to come up with some of these standards themselves. 4, assess closely where you're doing business. For example, in the United States, there's advantages of rule of law and innovation, but the litigation and sanctions issues are much more complex than they might be in other markets. In China, one has to watch deeds versus words. You got the special pressures that come out of the system, theft, and increasingly how your employees react to issues such as those going on in Hong Kong or Xinjiang or other provinces. And 5, diversify. Because I think this pattern that we've outlined is going to be increasingly one where you're going to see greater fragmentation. So the takeaway for business executives is that the political risks are increasing. You have to expect fragmentation, even possible breakdowns. And I've only touched on this, but I know many of you in this room are involved in these sectors. Kind of at the intersection of technology, trade, and security, you're going to see some of the greatest possibilities for decoupling here. Decoupling is a tricky word. It sort of suggests a full break. I'm not sure you'll see that, but you're going to see a lot more division. And I've already encountered some CEOs I talk to that often say European. They have to decide, are they going to be operating in the North American market, or are they going to be operating in the Chinese market? And some of them realize they might actually have to divide up the companies to be able to deal with that. So, of course, this depends on elections and policies going forward. But if we go in the direction that I believe we have been for 4 years, and you continue this for more years, I think you're going to see more of these challenges going forward. So,
thank you. Well, that was a really good overview of a lot of meaty issues that hopefully we can dig into a little deeper here. Bob, I was wondering if we might start with some of your comments about managed trade. Clearly you pointed to the fact that we're entering into a period of much more belief in managed trade and in devices like tariffs in the U.S. and, of course, other countries reacting to that. I think the figures I looked at, we've raised our tariffs on something like 20% of U.S. imports, and we've had tariffs raised on something like 12% of U.S. exports. And, this is perhaps the most extensive change since the last outbreak of managed trade that you and I remember well from the 1980s. Given that you played a major role in sort of our policy shift away from that kind of managed trade, and you propounded then the theory of competitive liberalization, which played a big part of where we went in the early 2000s. I'm just wondering about how concerned you are. Do you feel that we're now entering into a new age of competitive deliberalization? And if so, what would that mean for the U.S. economically?
Yeah, managed trade, this audience knows, is kind of one of those encapsulating words and can mean different things to different people. But I think it's like a poison that enters the bloodstream. And once it enters the bloodstream, it starts to lull people into different sort of illnesses, and others sort of get the connection with the disease. So I think it's a very pernicious sort of development. But let me get more specific. First, you have what I referred to as sort of the direct purchase requirements, which will primarily be addressing bilateral trade deficits and are going to have shifting effects. But you mentioned some of the experience in the 80s. There's always the derivative secondary effects. And the sad thing is they can cause trouble for the supposed beneficiary export as well as the the system as a whole. So remember when we did the VRAs with Japan on cars. So we wanted to limit the number of cars. So what did the Japanese do? They went up to higher value added production where they got sort of bigger margins. The semiconductor, where there was a percentage of semiconductors, didn't help the semiconductor industry because the Japanese basically sort of would buy them and throw them in some sort of different bins. What the semiconductor industry had to move up to sort of a different stage of value in production, where it's been quite successful, obviously, in sort of a leading effort. So there's the effect of direct purchases, because fundamentally what they do is they say, look, competition based on quality and price is no longer the critical variable. And that's a very dangerous thing if you want to rely on a market system. But the second part, which actually could be sort of more insinuating, is the indirect effects. So again, this audience has probably looked at this, but you look at those Department of Commerce proposed regulations on supply chains, and man, they're controlling everything. I mean, this is the command economy. Now, there'll be pushback, but it shows you kind of the degree of interest of having the government decide whether they're going to control your production chain, whether they're going to decide, we don't want you to invest in this country, we're watching this investment. So any of these can be sort of put in the garb of national security, but since national security covers everything from steel, aluminum to autos, there's really no stopping that's a process. The control of people. I mean, what people you can hire, where you can sort of move them around. This can become quite a dangerous thing. And in each individual case, if you're explaining it on TV or to a certain audience, you can act like you're using American power effectively, but I think it leads to a very serious erosion. Now, another part of it is that, it's the irony if some of our complaint, for example, against China is government or Communist Party control, you are strengthening the whole of the government and the Communist Party because they're the ones that will have to sort of guide and implement this. And the contrast, which I alluded to and you touched on, is that, look, it's the opposite of focusing your energies on a rules-based system, right? And look, in a rules-based system, now and then the United States has to compete. It's not always going to be first, but we've tended to believe that in the competition, we get the benefits from some of the imports and the innovation and ideas, but it keeps pushing us in a sort of a better direction. So you're moving away from a rules-based system to sort of a controlled one. And this other point that I mentioned, again, it's always hard to prove a negative on this, but I'm deeply concerned that the international system is not making rules for the future. So not only are we faltering on the rules of the past, but, at least the companies that I've been associated, big data as an asset is absolutely fundamental going forward. And what are the rules on data? They were kind of floundering our way through this process. So I think this is going to be one of the challenges for the trade system in the future.
So I want to get a little bit more to that issue of the rules-based system. We can talk about the WTO, but I wanted to, first of all, touch just a little bit, because there's a lot of interest in this audience, and it was discussed in earlier panels about the US-EU relationship. Some people at your prior panel said, very likely that as this wheel goes around, the next target of a lot of Trump's trade rhetoric will be on Europe. And I know you've had a lot of experience in US-EU relations, not just on trade, but on the broader relationships. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on these growing topics and what the implications might be. I got the sense on the panel with the reporters that we had just a little while ago, kind of people not necessarily buying into some of the rhetoric that Trump has had about the Europeans being just as bad as the Chinese, but maybe accepting that that's now becoming a little bit more, a more palatable argument in this town. And when you look at the actual numbers, if you look at our trade deficit with Europe in comparison to our total trade, it's something like 20% compared to 63% for China. We export $350 billion worth of goods to Europe. We have this vibrant trade and investment relationship. So what, in your view, are, put it in proper perspective about the U.S.-European relationship, and how problematic are the problems and how important is the relationship itself?
So if you're in Brussels, or if you're in the European Commission embassy here, or if you're a member state, or if you're representing companies that operate in a transatlantic fashion, it's a flashing yellow light and it's turning orange. One thing we know about Trump, he's not subtle, right? And so he said, you're next. I have a big bilateral trade deficit, and by the way, the Germans have been treating us unfairly, and the Germans are the heart of the economy. So where are you going to expect it? Building on your point, the auto sector is sort of just sitting there in part because Trump wants to use leverage. He's never accepted the notion of a European Union or community. And the autos is a great one because he can really smack the Germans, and the Germans might want to be sort of respond, but the French and some of the others say, well, why should we give in to some of this stuff? Okay, so he divides the EU. You have, for an apparent argument, if I recall, the European trade tariff on autos is 10%, ours is what, 2.5%? And so, it ignores that we have one of 25% on trucks, but nevertheless, it's kind of, for explaining it to an audience, how does that seem fair to people, right? And what's held it back is the fact that you've got enough of an industry in North America that, and frankly, this is where I think, smart representatives are going back to members of Congress that represent those companies, and others are kind of pushing back about the danger and the market sort of anxiety.
Well, how do you think the market would react if he actually pulled the trigger?
I think the market would react very negatively, so I don't expect to see it this year because we're in an election year and he wants the economy to go well, but I think you better darn well expect it the following year. But it also get connected. So on the other side, you've got the digital tax issue, right? And this is one where, I understand the argument why you want to sort of change the nature of the tax system. But in a way, this is where Europe's being quite unilateral in terms of how traditional tax systems have sort of required establishments.
Right.
So the problem, at least as I can see it here, is that frankly, some of the technology companies are willing to go along with this, but some of the other multinationals have now saying, well, wait a minute, we get swept in. And from your Ways and Means experience, what are they going to do? They're going to run to Congress, and the Finance and Ways and Means Committee will say, wait a minute, Mnuchin is negotiating our tax system for companies, right? And so you could see, if you've been in Washington, you could watch what was happening. First, Mnuchin is trying to do some of the OECD. Then there's a blowback. Then he says, then we need a safe harbor provision. How many times have we seen safe harbor provision? So you could follow this pattern, okay? But I don't see, again, this is one of the problems. You have an accumulation of these items, but this is not a team that's kind of believes in negotiations other than fantasy negotiations, which is kind of, the other guy drops dead and concedes everything and so on and so forth. And so
it'd be nice to do it if you could do it.
Yeah, that's from Kissinger, actually, Richard was saying. Then we got Airbus and Boeing, and here I feel some responsibility because some of the people in this room can testify. I brought the darn case. It took 15 years to sort of get where we are. But the original concept, I did this actually with the Boeing CEO at the time, I think it was Stonecipher. He said, look, we believe there's a strategic choice here about point-to-point travel versus hub travel. And they're building the 380 and we're building the 787. We think we did the better choice, she said, and therefore they're going to recognize it and they'll have to develop a competitor for the 787. And frankly, the past is the past, but we don't want them to have the support aid as they develop their alternative. It's exactly what happened. But what he was suggesting was, look, we want to negotiate our way out of this after we have some leverage. So will the Trump administration use this as a negotiation, or will they use it as a justification as a club, to move things forward? Another one, which, again, this audience may be aware of, most are not, the Europeans are quite serious about these carbon border taxes. Yeah. And, that came up in the discussions in the U.S. at various times. That is a very complicated sort of issue. So, on top of the traditional problems we had with agriculture and sort of other issues, I think you have to expect, if Trump is reelected, these are going to be very big issues. Even if Trump isn't elected, one of the interesting questions will be, how will a Democratic administration, they want to be different from Trump. They want to be, quote, multilateral. But as you know, a lot of the constituencies on their side are not exactly raving free traders. So I do think actually there's an environmental component of this. If I were thinking about it, I try to build in a sort of pro-environment, and border taxes need to be part of that.
Yeah. Well, so before we get some questions from the audience. We still have about a little over 11 minutes left. Let me just go to the prospect for eventually getting back to a more rule of law approach on better terms for the U.S. So, you know, the president said in Davos that the WTO needs reforming, or we may have to do something. I'm not sure exactly what that meant, but I can guess. And I'm just wondering how you assess the importance, first of all, of having a WTO system that is viable, but secondly, the need for reform, particularly to cope with big issues like the subsidy regimes. And do you think a realistic reform agenda is possible in this environment, or do we just get something started now and wait until there's a better moment to do it?
So you might think that I knew Cordell Hull, but I really only know him for his writing. But as some of you who lived through the early 2000s know, I get frustrated when it's the bilateral versus the multilateral global. The trick here is how to use the bilateral, the regional, and the global together. Okay, and the reason I bring up Cordell Hull was Cordell Hull in the 30s actually wanted to do something at a more multilateral level. It wasn't possible. So with the help of your predecessors on the Ways and Means Committee, he gets the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which is a series of bilateral agreements. And I think he did like 31 with like 28 countries.
Right.
But the key part was he gets the principles in there that become the basis of the GATT system going forward. So my logic has always been, you know, look, you don't want the U.S. to be chained so that with a big WTO, you have to agree with what 150, 160 countries agree with. You want to be able to innovate through free trade agreements. You know, in some ways, this is the sad thing about the TPP. TPP was a good example of where we're trying to go because you had free trade agreements with 6 of those 11. And for anybody that knows the details of these, unless they'd been experienced with that, you could have never expanded to 11. By the way, you could have probably done this in Latin America too. I mean, if I were in office now looking at the Brazilian, I'd sort of put something together with our Latin American free trade partners. But so coming back to the WTO, you want to still build these back into the WTO. Again, in the Doha round, you could see the early signs of this. We need some approach that allows what in APEC they call pathfinders or WTO or MFN plus, that sort of allows those who are willing to liberalize to commit without necessarily giving the benefits to everybody.
Right.
But some mechanism that keeps a baseline MFN, which will have, and given the nature of these issues, you could keep it in the tariff topics, but sort of as you move to these other standards and other types of issues, you got to pay to play the process. So that's sort of one sort of key step. Another key step is what I alluded to. Do we really want to tackle this issue of state subsidies? And there are precedents. The Singapore FTA, we did that with a competition policy. There were some provisions in the TPP. However, you know, the United States often is good at finding other people's problems, not necessarily our own weaknesses. Remember, some people might think we have agricultural subsidies and we have various subsidies. So you could either tackle that through smaller agreements or through sort of a global accord. I think the political reality is you need adjustment flexibilities. So one of the things that I stumbled on was I tried to use the safeguards in 2001 for steel. I was trying to get away from the gaming of the anti-dumping countervailing duty system. And I was trying to say, look, you need a relief that is temporary for industries and sort of go through some sort of adjustment. You're going to need something like that because the developed countries lowered their tariffs on all these sectors, and sort of now, you know, to bring them along politically, you need some sort of process like that. That brings you, that, by the way, links you to the dispute settlement issue. Because the reason the Lighthizer and others want to kill the dispute settlement system is they want to just use American power because they never liked the idea that the WTO could ultimately make a ruling. They want to go back to the old GATT system. Then, you know, I mentioned the carbon taxes. It's another issue that, you know, is going to have to be sort of dealt with in this context. These all raise the special and differential treatment, which this audience knows. I probably, if I were doing this strategically, I'd flag that issue, but I wouldn't try to negotiate it in concept. I negotiate it through these individual topics and try to get some fair sort of adjustment to the process. Exchange rates, frankly, there are provisions that should link this to the IMF. There are now ideas out there. Fred Bergston started some of them. They're now incorporated in some of these agreements so sort of could deal with this. So that's the agenda that you could pursue. Frankly, I was a little worried about this. Of course, it runs ultimately with the member states, but we're at an age where I think you need the Director General of the WTO to be pushing these more. And if you have a Director General of the WTO who basically comes out of the Geneva system, wants to play and get along with everybody, you're not going to push the agenda. You got to take some risks on some of these things. Now, your closing question is, would you do this? Would it work under Trump? Absolutely not. I mean, for the reasons I said, he cares about bilateral trade deficits. He wants America's leverage. He doesn't care about rules. So if Trump's reelected, the system will degrade. The interesting question is if you have a Democrat, and people should be thinking about this now, would they be willing to take on some of these issues? In what formula? And I'd like to believe that at least the ones who have a chance of beating Trump might be able to do this if you combined it with some of the environmental issues.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned Cordell Hull. I actually wanted to name our son Cordell Hull, but my wife put her foot down on that one. But I'm going to open up to the audience.
So was the choice Rufus?
Well, no, he got a better deal than that, but we won't go into that. Couple of questions. We only have about 5 minutes, but if we've got a couple of questions, let's see if somebody can start us out.
We got one over there.
I'm Greg Rushford. I occasionally publish the Rushford Report when I'm out of my semi-retired Solomons. How do you pronounce it?
Sometimes.
If you go to Harley-Davidson, the workers there take their jobs because they have access to Japanese transmissions and tires. And if you work for Cummins Engines, you need those foreign gaskets to keep your job in Indiana. The CEOs of such companies are reluctant to talk about that in terms that the ordinary Americans could understand. Do you have any ideas on how to persuade them otherwise to help turn around public opinion so people out in the country would recognize that trade is really important to their lives?
A couple thoughts. One, even as I've touched on today, I try to alert some members of that community that the risks are going to increase, okay? So understandably, CEOs are busy running their business. They're worried about getting Trump's ire. But at some point, you have to realize if these things accumulate, will it really add to your danger? Second, that's why I gave this speech to the U.S.-China Business Council, because frankly, that's a community that's really under siege for various reasons. And I was partly trying to point out, look, here are some of the things that we worked with China that worked, that led to cooperation while identifying problems for the future. And I was trying to urge them that they better speak up on some of these issues more than they had in the past. What I've seen is they tend to do it more through their trade associations. They're more comfortable doing it sort of as a group. That's okay. But frankly, the other part of it would be, talking to members of Congress, we've got, Rufus and other people in this room, Jim Colby, you can do a lot of that sort of one-on-one, or bring them to the plant, show them what's sort of going on. It doesn't have to be, out where you're catching all the ire. You're trying to explain the realities of how your company works to different people. Then for the employees, there's been a lot of work done about how you sort of explain this to people. So when I was USTR, Roy Blunt and he was at that point, I think, the Republican whip, we did a little tour that he was using as a trial where we went to 3 or 4 different media markets in his district and small companies, and kind of showing how sales worked, and it got sort of local news and so on and so forth. So there's mechanisms out there that you have to sort of build it with. And just to give you a connection, I also serve on the Carnegie Endowment Board, and Bill Burns is the president there. They've done this very interesting project where they've worked with a local university, others in Nebraska, Colorado, and Ohio, and they're kind of asking what foreign policy matters to you, okay? And the trade shows up, but again, people need to have a slightly fuller discussion of the aspects of it. So look, I'm not naive about this. I know the sort of the challenge that one faces with it, but again, I think as one looks at the sort of the larger effects, the question is, will public officials and some businesses be willing to go out to make the case? So look, one other point, this is on the government side. The Obama administration ran against NAFTA, and frankly, I know from friends there, they were banned to talk about NAFTA for 5 or 6 years. Okay, so look, if only one side makes the case, do you really expect to win it? Okay, now the amazing thing about this is the reason we ended up with the USMCA we did is that after 25 years, North American integration was strong enough that it actually resisted the real ideas that these guys had, okay? And it resisted what AMLO wants to do in sort of Mexico. So you can build these networks of support, but it takes time and effort in different groups.
So I think if we had one last quick question, right there.
Yes, hi, I'm Jeannie Saylor with Schneider Electric, and thank you. I was actually at State when you were there, so back in the day. I want to ask you about your advice to business. I'm specifically thinking about how do we vocalize our support for more multilateralism and supporting the institutions that create certainty and predictability, but also kind of focus on the need to have a plan for each market in a potentially bifurcated or divided world, and sort of how do we balance those two, sort of appearing connected locally with the market that we're in, but also supporting, multilateralism. And then do you have any advice on how to be more effective as business in supporting the globalization that helps us?
Well, in the brief time we have, as probably everybody in this room knows from different companies, different executives have different proclivities for this. And you have to sort of test, and the basic point is you have to make it real to people, okay? So you have to show why the standards matter, why the tariffs or restrictions, about 60% of imports are for intermediate goods or commodities. So, that effect. And then, as I've talked about, disruptions of logistics and supply chains, and then you have to think about first, how does your company practically deal with this, okay? And that really also deals with issues of the employees and kind of what employees want. So again, I've worked in the financial sector. Interestingly enough, some of the big banks found that their employees, for areas like private wealth management and others, were excited about how they could try to do some support, whether it's a sustainable development project or some other types of dimension that, beyond the sort of traditional investing. So it'll be the nature of the future workforce. So you start with the company, and you start with the communities, and you start, of course, understanding what your actors are interested in. Some people, executives, sort of want to move to a different level. They sort of like to engage on some of the topics. Or, Union Pacific, I met the CEO's got, it's a company that depends on the trade system through the United States and North America. So it's real for them, and they think in more systemic terms. Some of the people, that, for example, that had the U.S.-China Business Council, they start to see the systemic connections. And then, as these questions have suggested, look, you can't ask people to commit suicide. So, you have to sort of figure out a strategy where you can try to find something that's kind of a win-win, or if you're afraid of sort of Trump's wrath, work through members of Congress. Look, I haven't been sort of warmly excited about some of my Republican senator friends in terms of courage and fortitude on these issues. But what they will say to me is they say, look, we try to be effective behind the scenes, and on some of the issues like autos and others, they think they have been. We'll see over time. But that's in part because people have come to them and given them stories about how disruptive it is. So the bottom line point is we're at a stage where, frankly, we're trying to prevent really bad stuff from happening, okay? And there's sort of those good examples to use. My greater worry, as I've sort of hinted, is that it's the opportunity cost. We're not framing things for the future. And particularly in various technology industries, this is staring you in the face, okay? So if you're in, I remember when we were trying to get TPA passed, I could never get the 2 votes from the congresswoman from Silicon Valley. And I kind of thought, geez, it's international business. But they were at a stage where that didn't ring to them. Today it rings, okay? It rings quite loud, okay? So this is where we all have to be, it's just as you would think about as you're working a congressional issue, you have to be a little tactical, opportunistic, kind of fit the situation. That's different than this question about sort of framing the larger debate. But for those of you doing that job, you have to think in those terms. And also build allies, coalitions, right?
Let's all thank Bob Zoellick.